Go.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. My name is Chris Martin, and I am the Associate Director of the Davis Center for Russian Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Thank you so much for joining us today for the fourth panel in our series, Decolonization in Focus. This series is now in its third year, having previously centered on the themes of race and intersectionality. The series has received generous sponsorship from the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, also known as ACES, and from peer regional centers throughout the US. I would invite our viewers today to view all 6 of the panels, which have been scheduled throughout February and March. Each session has been or will be live streamed and recorded for future viewing in case you should miss any. Before we start, I want to recognize my colleagues, Zsuzsanna Magdo from the University of Pittsburgh and Laura Sargent from the Davis Center, who have been instrumental in developing and implementing the series. And I'd like to take a moment to thank our institutional sponsors, including our peer regional studies centers at the Universities of Chicago, Wisconsin-Madison, Kansas, Michigan, Texas at Austin, California, Berkeley, as well as Ohio State University, UNC Chapel Hill, Indiana University Bloomington, and George Washington University for their generous support. And last but not least, our gratitude also goes to today's speakers for answering our call and stepping into this crucial conversation. Our topic today is Decolonization, Impact Beyond the Ivory Tower. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Professor Douglas Rogers. Doug Rogers is a professor of anthropology at Yale University. His research and teaching interests lie in political and economic anthropology, natural resources, especially oil and energy, corporations, the anthropology of religion and ethics, historical anthropology, and socialist societies and their post-socialist trajectories. His archival and ethnographic research in Russia has led to 2 award-winning books, including The Old Faith and the Russian Land, a historical ethnography of ethics in the Urals, Cornell Press, 2009, and The Depths of Russia, Oil, Power, and Culture After Socialism, Cornell University Press, 2015. He has directed Yale's program in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and he currently serves as the chair for anthropology. But before I turn it over to Doug, a bit of housekeeping. Please use Zoom's Q&A function to post questions for our speakers. Any questions submitted through YouTube will be shared with our moderator. With that, Doug, I think we're ready. I'll turn it over to you.
Right. Thank you, Chris. Welcome, everybody, to this panel on decolonization's impact beyond the Ivory Tower. I will be your moderator, and I guess I'm not the host. I guess Chris is the host, and the Davis Center is the host, and we're all grateful for them for putting together this panel and this series. But for the next hour and a half, I will moderate this panel. It's a pleasure to introduce you to the 3 speakers. What I'm planning to do is introduce the 3 of them to you now in the order in which they will speak. Each of them will then speak for about 15 minutes, talking a little bit about what decolonization means in their own area of expertise. Then after that, there'll be plenty of time for questions from those of you who are attending, for conversation among the panelists, and in general for collectively working through some of the issues raised by this important topic and by their introductory comments. So let me then just do some introductions to the panelists. We're going to begin with Erika Marat, who is an associate professor and chair of the Regional and Analytical Studies Department at the College of International Security and Affairs, National Defense University. She has previously directed the Homeland Defense Fellowship Program at the College of International Security and Affairs. Dr. Marat's research focuses on violence, mobilization, and security institutions in Eurasia, India, and Mexico. Her recent book is entitled The Politics of Police Reform: Society Against the State in Post-Soviet Countries. That's Oxford, 2018. And her articles have appeared in Foreign Affairs, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and Open Democracy. Following Dr. Marat will be Anna Reis, who is the librarian for Slavic and East European Studies at Yale University, where she's responsible for collections and reference pertaining to Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. She holds both a master's degree in library science and Russian, Central European, East European, and Eurasian Studies from the University of Indiana, Bloomington. And she has worked on a number of decolonization issues for several years, both in curating and in library exhibits and in publication about those. And she'll be speaking about that today. Finally, we'll be hearing from Fatima Lis, who is an investigative reporter at Voice of America. Fatima is an award-winning investigative reporter with extensive experience in the conflict-ridden North Caucasus, where she has covered the most sensitive topics affecting the region, including human rights violations, torture and detention, women's rights, nationalist sentiments, the role of Islam in regional affairs, and abuses of power by authorities. She has served as editor-in-chief of the Regnum News Agency, that was from 2004 to 2007, and has reported for Russia's Novaya Gazeta, the Associated Press, the Institute for War and Peace, the Jamestown Foundation, and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Ms. Lies has been a Carr Center Fellow and a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, and is a recipient of the Gerd Bucerius Freedom of Expression Award, the Amnesty International UK Media Award, the Rory Pack Trust Award, the Human Rights Watch Helman Hemant Award, and the Lewis Lyons Award for Conscience and Integrity in Journalism. This is a distinguished panel, and if you are on the panel, I would ask you to imagine the audience giving you a round of applause to welcome you and to indicate their interest in hearing what you have to say. According to the order we've set out, Erica, you'll begin by speaking for about 15 minutes, and then we'll move on to Anna and Fatima. So, Erica, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this amazing panel and for holding a series of really great conversations on decolonial thinking and activism. I encourage everyone to listen to previous talks and attend future talks as well. So today I'll be talking about decolonial activism beyond the Ivory Tower and Central Asia, and I'll be focusing mostly on Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan because those two countries see the greatest rise in decolonial activism, and probably because they are more politically free compared to other Central Asian countries. But that's not to say that decolonial thinking has not been on the rise in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan as well. It's just we see less of it in public spaces, and it's harder to research as well. So even before the war in Ukraine, for about a decade, the decolonial voices in academia and the civil society communities have been growing. They really accelerated during the pandemic when various activists and academics were able to, from across the world were able to connect online and hold conversations together. And the main thrust in both academic and artist communities has been resistance to the existing and normalized discourse about Central Asia, about its Soviet past and its current alignment with Russia. The resistance, and I'll share my slides here, has focused on the notion that it's really there's really something wrong with how both Russian literature and Western literature depict Soviet period in Central Asia as being this modernizing great experience for Central Asians, because in the most crude terms, if not for the Soviets, Central Asia would end up like Afghanistan. Never mind that Afghanistan is also a fantastic country that has suffered from external militant influences. And this really dominant discussion in literature about electrification, education, modernization in Central Asia has been challenged. And this is a picture from art gallery in Bishkek depicting a typical picture of Soviet people in this instance, Soviet women in Kyrgyzstan and their children being really happily employed in cotton fields. Again, normative presentation of the benefits of the Soviet system. But if you look closer, and especially if you have children, this is really an atrocious picture of human suffering. Women and children exposed to sun, and women having to do both, to raise children and pick cotton. And the discussions in academia especially scholars from Central Asia, started asking really difficult questions. So Bota Kassimbekova and Nacho Kubaeva wrote in their amazing article in Central Asian Survey in 2021 about, do we really know Central Asia if we haven't heard from those who were oppressed by the system or who had to flee it? Because what we what really know about Central Asia is how the winners, so the occupiers, wrote about Central Asia based on their understanding what is good for the empire, and not so much from the local perspectives. And by definition, both Kassimbekova and Chukubaeva say that a colonial experience cannot be liberating, it cannot be modernizing, and necessarily good for those for native populations. And similar sentiments have been rising in the arts community. That also, art is, I'm not an expert on art, but it really touched me, some of the artwork, modern artworks that were presented or created by artists like Saule Suleimanova in Kazakhstan, when she used cellophane painting as a medium. So cellophane is a medium to depict historical images of Kazakhs and Kazakh culture. So she replicated photographs taken during the Soviet period, and she chose cellophane as a medium because of its multi-layered meanings that depict cellophane represents this abundant product in our environment. It's also very colorful, it's durable, but it's also trash very often. And so she depicted this Kazakh culture, and her other work also shows images of suffering, of protest, of hunger in Kazakhstan through cellophane paintings. That it's something that is with us, but it's also it has all those other meanings, that it's durable, it's abundant, but it's also treated as trash. Another artist from Kyrgyzstan, Alkan Kapalova, also is at the forefront of decolonial thinking in Central Asia. And this is her depiction of the exodus of Kyrgyz in 1916, when thousands of Kyrgyz were fleeing Tsarist draft into the First World War. And this installation is made of metal rods. It's a stencil of people on horseback backs up in the mountains. So this installation is up in the mountains in Issyk region in Kyrgyzstan. And when the wind blows, those metal rods move as well and produce sound, and it feels like the people are moving as well. And she specifically put this installation high in the mountains and not somewhere in public spaces, let's say along the road, main highways, or cities, to show that our ancestors had to flee through high, really go up in the mountains to flee Tsarist draft. So we can also go up in the mountains to see and appreciate their memory. So what we see here is, on the one hand, in the academic community, there is this call to understand what is lost in our memory, in our understanding of the Soviet regime, on the one hand, and then also depiction of trauma in the artist community, and depiction of sense of loss of cultural heritage. And with the war in Ukraine, those decolonial initiatives, they spilled into the mainstream. More and more people became interested in learning about their history, what is lost, again, through trauma, through suffering, through a sense of lost cultural heritage. And this is one of the many discussions in Kazakhstan on the meaning and the loss and trauma of the Great Hunger that was imposed by Stalin in the 1930s in Kazakhstan, where after 40% of Kazakhs perished. This is an example of books published by SMD project in Kyrgyzstan. SMD translates as I remember, of oral history narratives of people who lost someone and that really touches basically every family in Kyrgyzstan, someone in the Stalin purges or the Second World War. So what does that mean for our society, for our understanding of the Soviet regime? And they really had to confront such dilemmas as, on the one hand, well, every family had to go through trauma of losing someone, but on the other hand, we still see among older generations that there were proud in their contribution to their Soviet past and contribution to the Soviet empire. So how do we reconcile the sense of trauma, but also the sense of nostalgia for the Soviet regime? It resonated with a lot of people, the books, and it resonated with me as well, because we too in my family have this sense of the duality of losing memory, but also having our grandmothers and grandfathers succeed in the Soviet regime. So being the privileged class in the Soviet regime. The baby on this picture is my paternal grandmother. She is Tatar, and that's her mother. So my grandmother, the baby, that picture was taken at about sometime in 1916, 1917, during the revolution, probably. Just before everything changed, was the Bolsheviks ascending to Central Asia. So my grandmother became a communist leader, reached high ranks, but we have no memory of what happened to her mother. So my grandmother, we have no traces of her, what happened to her. She basically perished in history. So SMD projects, they started as this really niche discourse that encapsulated just really several NGOs and society activists, but now it became this massive public gathering for different, really, people with different backgrounds in Kyrgyzstan. Many people are attracted to listening to SMD presentations. This specific picture is from their presentation of SMD scholars or researchers working in Kherson archives in Ukraine months before the Russian invasion, and being able to retrieve archival material of Kyrgyz purged into Ukraine by Stalin. And again, this attracted a lot of attention from various groups in Bishkek and beyond. And they work in remote, so in villages as well. This is a fantastic example of how the discourse on decolonization goes beyond just the discussions in English or Russian language. This is an initiative, this grassroots initiative of explaining decolonization as bulozungo kaitu, meaning decolonization as finding yourself, returning to yourself. An explanation on Instagram that was really watched many times, that decolonial thinking is really emancipatory thinking away from what has been imposed by Soviets, by Russians, by anyone else, and trying to reflect on what is meaningful and what is important for ourselves as a nation. This is another example of when decolonial thinking it goes beyond academia, and this is a presentation by Olga Moon in Almaty, Kazakhstan. She's herself a scholar in Oxford University from Kazakhstan, also discussing decolonialization and how academia is hierarchical and unfair to Central Asia. She's at a TEDx event in Kazakhstan. So the mainstreaming of decolonial thinking became really is a phenomenon that we see since the Russian invasion into Ukraine, and beyond activism, beyond art activism or academic discussions, it also now captured the private sector. This is an example of ads for coffee shops. I think it's called Coffee Boom chain that highlights and takes pride in Kazakh. So this is an artist, Aika art. So she's artist in Kazakhstan. So she takes pride in the nomadic heritage and cultural heritage of Kazakhs, and she combines that with the more present day lifestyle in Kazakhstan by showing that. So there's a promo for the coffee brand that spread all across Kazakhstan in big and small cities. But this is a way of, again, not seeing native culture or nomadic culture, importantly nomadic culture, as something backwards, as the Soviets portrayed to us, but something to be proud of and enjoy in daily lives. This is another example of combining nomadic symbols. So the yurts, bozui, in Kyrgyzstan was a sporting event. It's a race, international race, with people coming from neighboring countries as well. And the athletes stay in yurts overnight, and then the race. And this is a way of reclaiming past cultural heritage, being proud of a nomadic past. This is a recent phenomenon that it is now becomes normalized in daily life as well. And of course, I can't not mention the yurts of invincibility. That was even mentioned by Secretary Yellen when she visited Kiev. She was impressed by tents of invincibility in Kiev that provide electricity and I think Wi-Fi connection and warmth in case of shutdowns, electric blackouts. And this is how the pride in our own culture and informed through and fueled through decolonial thinking is now becoming a foreign policy example of foreign policy influence as well. Although this the yurt was many yurts were donated by the private sector in Kazakhstan. So there are many different initiatives. So it's really amazing to see proliferation. And of course, the concept of decolonial thinking is understood in many different ways across different groups, from activists to academics to entrepreneurs. Everyone puts different meaning in decolonial thinking, and I know that we have some members. I think Alexa Kurmanov here, who rightly points that decolonial thinking there is certain discomfort with how decolonial thinking becoming mainstreamed, as opposed to provoking discomfort in discussion and trying to push the limits of how thinking is. When it's mainstreamed, it's kind of loses its meaning and importance. But it definitely became fashionable to think decolonial in a decolonial way, and thinking, being proud in our heritage, and understanding Soviet regime as a traumatic experience. And so all this is fantastic development in Central Asia. I'm really happy to see it. This is something we never imagined would happen with such speed and such engagement from the public. And of course, it is important for us to continue rethinking our past and our belonging, our identity, but it's not enough for the colonized to be thinking in decolonial terms. It's really important for the colonizer as well to reflect on what the history what are the legacies of brutal history and how it continues to cause harm to Russia's neighbors. Thank you. I think my time's up.
Erica, thank you for a wonderful start to this panel, illustrated by some terrific images that I'm sure we'll have time to talk about a little bit later. But for now, we're going to turn things over to Anna. Anna, you ready to go?
Yes, I am. Just a second. I will put my slides up on the screen. And okay. All right. Well, thank you, Doug. Thank you so much to ACs and all the sponsors for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. I'm Anna Arez. I'm the librarian for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies at Yale University Library. And I've been asked to offer my perspective as a non-faculty professional working within Russian and Eurasian Studies on how I think about decolonization and how it shows up in my work. As a practitioner of so-called knowledge work, I can say that much important thinking and theorizing on power relationships and human bias has been done and is being done within the spheres of knowledge classification and information literacy, as well as in emerging fields like machine learning and AI. These questions are foundational to the field of information science, and they touch every cultural heritage institution in some way. And I want to talk about some recent lessons learned that I think are broadly applicable in concrete ways inside and outside the academy. I also want to offer some thoughts on how we might define decolonization relative to other goals for our collections and institutions. So I want to begin with some general definition of terms because it's worth emphasizing that the modern library performs a lot of complex functions that are mostly invisible to everyday users. When we think about library work, here are some of the things that work might be referring to. Collection stewardship, which encompasses what is collected, how it is described, in what way it is stored, and how it is made available to researchers. Subject expertise, which is the human component of what researchers seek out when they visit a research collection, which is to say librarians and curators who can interpret what they find there. Community resources like spaces, events, and staff that provide a welcoming environment and help different kinds of people to feel like the resources being provided are for them to use. Institutional infrastructure, including leadership administration, but also IT and AV infrastructure, which is completely indispensable to contemporary libraries. And finally, collaborative infrastructure, which encompasses the people and collections that constitute regional and global networks that libraries rely on to give users access to the greatest number of materials from the greatest number of places. These elements can be found in most types of libraries and in other types of cultural heritage institutions as well. And I lay them all out here because I want to emphasize that libraries are and have always been complex organizations, and their relationship to colonial and imperial legacies is accordingly complicated. So here I want to define how I bring Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies into this discussion. Much of my thinking on decolonial concepts has been shaped by a book I co-edited with colleagues in my field, Megan Broundorf and Aaron Pappas at University of Chicago and UVA, respectively, which grew out of our mutual interest in decolonization as practice, as well as our general sense that area studies librarianship, the branch of librarianship we occupy, has had little literature attached to it that practitioners can consider as a whole, rather than as specialists within their areas of practice. As we outlined in our introduction, while the academy at large mostly shifted away from the area studies paradigm in the post-Cold War era in favor of initiatives and organizations that were conceptualized as more global, with attendant restructurings and reallocations of resources, much of internationally focused librarianship had never quite shifted away from the area studies paradigm due to the practical requirements of maintaining area collections. In this way, area studies librarianship is a site to compare the two approaches and find how each is, in their own way, fraught, and neither fully challenges the Anglo and Eurocentric norms from which they arose. With the global paradigm, there is a visible flattening of sites of difference and inequity in pursuit of totalizing disciplinary approaches, despite its aims toward greater inclusion and egalitarianism. With area studies, there is the ingrained superiority of the position of curator or researcher relative to collected or researched subject, despite the model's capacity for cultural nuance, as well as its championing of interdisciplinarity. And so I want to take a look at a few key points our colleagues surfaced as contributors to our book, in hopes that they might present an instructive way to think about the ways in which the library is a colonial artifact and what it might take to decolonize it. Together, they illustrate a cycle we find ourselves in as practitioners of information stewardship. The first tenet of that cycle is that collections shape our collective knowledge of the world. One of our contributors was Michael Erdman, the curator for Turkish and Turkic collections at the British Library, who ruminates on the history and function of his curatorial area within an institution that was essentially designed to document empire. Of the many vital points he raises, the one I want to emphasize is the way in which global collections of this nature have shaped Western perceptions of the globe and vice versa. Writing about the development of the British Library's Ottoman manuscript collection, Erdman says, if, as Said argues, the East was perceived as decadent, luxurious, and languid, this too had to be reflected in the choice of manuscripts for acquisition, confirming as part of a circular loop Western understandings of Islamic values and their worldviews. The humble legal document affecting a sale of a movable property helps us understand the workings of the Ottoman economy. Nonetheless, its failure to represent a sensuous and irrational Orient meant that it was often ignored, passed over in favor of lavishly decorated divans and exquisite calligraphic praxis. The second step in that cycle is the way information is ranked and classified relative to collections it lives alongside. Erdman's point about acquisitions is carried forward further by Jose Herrera, whose essay chronicles the transfer of the collection of Luis Alberto Sanchez, a Peruvian intellectual and bibliophile, to Penn State University in the late 1960s, where it was eventually dissembled and microfilmed. In it, he draws valuable distinctions between the relative perceived worth of collections on American and Western European thought, which were organized and tended to within the core norms of the library science profession in the West, while non-Western collections typically proliferated through unfocused accumulation and were routinely separated from provenance information and other markers that would assign them a meaningful intellectual history, often rehoused or reformatted when their fragile condition made them unusable. Herrera writes, in his entry on Pennsylvania State University Libraries for the Encyclopedia of Library and Information Science, Stuart Forth, who became Dean of Libraries in 1973, narrates the transition from a fledgling library with inadequate holdings into a modern, increasingly automated facility, boasting significant collections in English, American, and German literature, and in Slavic resources and Hispanic resources. The modern library produces and encapsulates an epistemic difference, Eurocentric literature as comprehensive universal knowledge, area studies resources as plural fractured raw materials. The final result of that cycle, of course, is that knowledge extracted from collections shapes their trajectory in perpetuity. A complicating factor is that the relative status of area materials within collections is also in some cases perpetuated by and exacerbated by their relative status in their countries of origin. In writing about the North Caucasus and American library collections, Kit Condell of the University of Illinois surfaces how the short shrift that the peripheries of Russian Empire were given in library collections has as much to do with that peripheral status, even as the West positioned the Russian Empire itself as neither of the West nor entirely separate from it. He takes that positionality as an entry point to ask whether libraries and librarians can do more to delve into the intellectual life of these places more deeply, to probe these historical intellectual networks as a means of filling in the gaps that have limited our intellectual landscape. Writing about the legacy of the Kumyk intellectual Abu Sufyan Akayev and its relative absence in Western scholarship, Condell says Akayev himself was a noted collector, and his collection was destroyed as part of the Soviet regime's own quasi-imperial project. As collectors today, shouldn't we be concerned with Akayev's own concerns at least as much as our own? What kinds of materials did Akayev and his contemporaries collect? What did they see as valuable? How can those collections teach us about the context in which they were created? And how can they suggest other avenues for contemporary collection development? Condell's suggestion points at one of the essential routes on the path to decolonization, that of vastly broadening networks of intellectual exchange through partnership, active engagement, and most crucially, material support of people and institutions in marginalized and historically subjugated areas. Area studies librarianship has long served as a complicated nexus point for such support, providing essential business relationships to publishers and booksellers worldwide, yet it has also made international partners deeply dependent on those relationships for their survival. In the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, international booksellers working with American libraries suffered an almost total deprivation of income as those libraries halted material shipping in response to lockdown orders, prompting an official response from many area studies librarian organizations, including AC's Committee on Library and Information Resources. While an act of solidarity, it also served to highlight the mechanisms would bring the flow of information from periphery to center, and how those mechanisms don't serve all participants equally well. What would be a more equitable version of such relationships? How can librarians engage researchers to support that goal? And what is the model of intellectual exchange we should be striving for? I cannot offer ready answers to any of those questions, but change isn't likely while these asymmetric relationships to intellectual and monetary capital persist. While knowledge is power is perhaps too simplistic a phrase to use, it does get to the heart of why decolonization issues in relation to libraries are so fundamentally fraught. Libraries are often seen as value-neutral organizations, despite their origins in the same systems of oppression that are criticized in contemporary discourse. In performing the social service of curating as well as facilitating access to information, libraries and librarians wield significant power over whose voices are culturally relevant. How that stewardship takes place in a decolonial context should ultimately be decided by those people whose voices one is trying to amplify. Zoe McLaughlin, South and Southeast Asia librarian at Michigan State University, highlights projects within Eurasian Studies employing a mix of what might be termed digital repatriation, in which materials in a Western institution are digitized and made available to an institution in their country of origin, and non-extractive collecting. The latter model, in which a collection stays within its native context, but its local stewards receive resources to digitize and further sustainably preserve the materials in exchange for digital surrogates to the partner institution, is gaining traction as a method to sustain international collecting without the exploitative practices such collecting often employed in the past. Still, even with these types of progressive models, it's important to be mindful of how and when power is wielded, shared, and ceded among parties. As McLaughlin notes, to be truly decolonized, these projects must benefit Indigenous partners in concrete, tangible ways. That may or may not include material benefit to a Western partner, which is part of the reality of decentering Western perspectives. With that, I want to close with a quote from an article many of our authors cited, and which has likely shown up in some form in the course of this series, which urges us to remember that decolonization as a concept grew out of concrete movements by Indigenous groups to achieve repatriation and restitution of physical possessions. Eve Tuck and Kei Wan Yang write, decolonization brings about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. It is not a metaphor for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. The easy adoption of decolonizing discourse by educational advocacy and scholarship, evidenced by the increasing number of calls to decolonize our schools or use decolonizing methods or decolonize student thinking, turns decolonization into a metaphor. As important as their goals may be, social justice critical methodologies or approaches that decenter settler perspectives have objectives that may be incommensurable with decolonization. For librarians and other professionals who work directly with broad local and international communities, I think this stands as a reminder that our work has practical applications in which decolonization can and should occupy concrete space. In area studies librarianship, there can be a slippage in terminology between decolonization and diversification. To diversify a collection, to expand its voice and bring new perspectives in, is fundamentally not the same practice as engaging in restoration and restitution to people who have been deprived. For that reason, it is essential for decolonizing work in libraries to begin with the people and places affected by colonial and imperial legacy, with their intellectual history and our professional counterparts in their regions, so that it can carry forward with their guidance. Despite the complicated history of the profession, librarians do occupy a fairly unique position of trust in most social contexts. And I think that decolonization is one of the goals toward which that unique position can prove most valuable. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for that presentation, and particularly for your effort to frame a particularly timely and significant set of questions in the larger transformations of library work these days. I think that will be very helpful for the conversation to follow. But before we get to that, Fatima, it is your turn to talk a little bit about your experience and expertise. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. This is so exciting and so important to be part of it. And this initiative is just amazing. Thank you for inviting me to talk, especially because I'm what Russia calls ethnic minority. I'm a Circassian. I was born and raised in the country that does not exist because Russia erased it from the map and tries erasing it still up until today, erasing it from the memory. A Circassian minority in Russia is divided even in smaller groups because even as a minority, probably Circassians were too many for Russia to handle as one nation. these Circassians suffered what Georgia recognized as a genocide, and there are books about that written by American scholars. For instance, Walter Richmond wrote The Circassian Genocide, a book that actually chronicles the documents from the Russian imperial archives, the genocide, the massacre of the Circassians, the mass deportation. At this point, we have around 6 million Circassians living in more than 50 countries abroad, and less than 1 million Circassians living in Russia. And those, even the Circassians who live in Russia, are now called the Kabardians, the Adygayans, the Circassian Cherkess. There are Shapsug and other people who all we call ourselves Adyga, others call us Circassians. But in Russia, we are treated as different people and called as different people. We are divided administratively, and there are 3 republics where the Circassians today consist either a majority or second in the number of the population. Those Circassians living abroad, they struggle, even those who live in Russia today, struggle for survival of the nation. Their identity is under threat. Russia prevents the Circassians from repatriation. That's the continuation of the same imperial policies. Nothing has changed. Either Russia is an empire or a Soviet socialist country, or the system is called a Russian Federation. For my people, for the Circassians, there was no difference in the way the state handled my nation and our survival. So decolonization in the way it's viewed in the Western culture, in the Western history and politics, what we see the British Empire done, French Empire, other empires. Russia has never done that. It remains an empire, and even its war in Ukraine, as many know, is an imperial war. Trying to decolonize the country that is a sovereign, internationally recognized, independent nation. So there are not just Circassians, many other people for whom decolonization is a question of survival as a nation, as a people. When I was a child, and I, of course, went to the school. They have different school systems in Russia for ethnic minorities and for ethnic Russians. But even in a school program designed for Circassians, there was no a single word Circassian or Circassia in our history books. We didn't know where we came from. Only our family oral history was that left to us to remember who we are and what happened to us. Our songs, our whole oral history, and no written history, because Russia has done everything possible to erase that. In the Stalin times, even after the Soviet socialist revolution, when they claimed that all the nations are free and equal in the Soviet Union under the Communist Party, nothing that was true. There were Circassian scholars, folklorists whose works had been burned, and they died in Gulag, dozens of them. invaluable collections of historic ethnic songs telling the history of struggle against the Russian Empire, tales, narrations that were telling the true stories. All of that is lost. People in diasporas struggle trying to remember their language, trying to use their language, keep it alive. One of the most recent examples, for instance, these earthquakes in Syria and in Turkey, they affected the Circassian population. Circassian villages were destroyed. Circassian people died. What did Russia do? We saw a lot of propaganda on social media, in the Russian diplomatic channels, in the traditional Russian state media, about Russia being so generous in helping people affected by the earthquake. But what's the truth behind all those reports when it comes to the Circassians? Many Circassian organizations appealed to the Russian Foreign Ministry, to the Kremlin, asking to allow those affected by the earthquake repatriate, where people in the homeland could help them, could accept them, give them necessary aid and homes, at least temporary shelter. It was either ignored or outright denied, the same as happened during the war in Syria. Russia categorically denied the appeal of the Circassian organizations to allow repatriation of the Circassians to their homeland in the Caucasus. Those who managed somehow to get back home to their homeland, ancestral homeland, they never got any help from the government apart from being, having to renew their business visas, or having to exit Russia and enter again with the new visas, having to learn Russian language as a condition for staying in Russia. Any sort of pretense to keep the Circassians from returning to their home. For my people, as I said before, decolonization of Russia, I'm not saying it has to be bloody or has to be violent, but decolonization is an essential part of their condition for their survival. As a journalist, studying to become a journalist in Russia, I was taught, indoctrinated with the idea that as an ethnic Circassian, I cannot report on the issues that my people, the Circassians, experienced, that it was unethical, and I cannot stay unbiased if I report on my own people. When I started working, I had my pieces, articles about the Circassians being denied by my editors in Moscow. I remember even asking my Moscow editor, is it okay if a Russian journalist writes about ethnic Russians, Ruskiye? He said, why not? And I said, but you just denied my piece on the basis of me being a Circassian. How is it possible? He said, that's a very different issue. It can't be done like that. So chauvinism is embedded in the consciousness of people, the Russian people in Russia, unfortunately, because it was going on for so many years. It was part of the indoctrination program by the government since the Russian Empire, that the Russian ethnic Russians were the big brother, the better people. better than any other people in Russia. It was normal. It was a norm. Unfortunately, that remains true today. When we read the Russian media, generation after generation, what you see about, first of all, ethnic minorities, non-Russians, let's put it that way, rarely made it to the top news. When they do, it's a very negative coverage, very chauvinistic coverage. Central Asians are this, they can even use this derogative language for Central Asians, as the same as they use for the people from the Caucasus. I was arrested, for instance, once in Moscow because my editors at that time, Общая Gazeta, invited me for the editorial meeting in Moscow from the Caucasus. I came in Moscow and I was staying in the hotel, and I didn't know that, but apparently simultaneously the Moscow police and the FSB was running the special operation called Black Fatima. So my name is Fatima apparently, and there was no way I could avoid being arrested during that operation, of course. So that was part of life and remains part of life. People don't even realize how chauvinistic the system is and how much non-Russians suffer in this system. We hear about the coverage in the West that comes out of Russia and about Russia. Usually the Western coverage, follows the Russian mainstream lead or the Kremlin lead. The Kremlin makes a statement or makes a move and the Western media covers it. The Kremlin is not interested in covering ethnic minorities oppressed by its system. Designed to be covered. Those topics are designed to be covered. Covered up, not covered in Russia. So apparently, unfortunately, the Western media falls for that. In Russia, what we call here, what we think here, and it is true, of course, the values of pure journalism, of good journalism, being unbiased, being truthful, verifying your information. In Russia, that's perceived as weakness that could be exploited, and they do exploit it. When the Kremlin or the Russian media report something about ethnic minorities, here in the West, the people need to, the journalists have to check that information and report it. Most of the time, we see that Chechens are terrorists. Those are separatists, the Tatars are extremists, the Circassians are separatists, and all that stuff, unfortunately, leaks into the Western media, or the Western media doesn't cover it at all. You can rarely see anything apart from, Moscow or Russia in the Western media. We had an exception during the Sochi Olympic Games in 2014 when the Circassian issue, my people's issue, got some attention, mainly because Sochi used to be the capital of Circassia before Russia took it from us. So I think the Western media, I understand that there is, a need of covering top news, following the top news, being in the cycle, but there are very important issues that absolutely skip attention, and media, apart from informing, I think has another mission, educational mission, and also the mission to be able to cover something that the authoritarian regimes like Russian don't want to be covered. And that specifically in the Russian situation, it's the issue of ethnic minorities. The people reduced to ethnic minorities by Russia. And that issue doesn't receive any attention in the West. It's not just about the media. When we talk about the grants, media grants, for instance, how many grants can you recall given to ethnic minorities in the support of free press in Russia? I don't know any Circassian media organization. I actually recommended few of such organizations. They asked me for my support, and I wrote a recommendation letter to several big foundations. They never got any money. But the Russian groups, Russian media groups that call themselves opposition or democratic, they get millions. The same goes for scholarships and for scientific community. We don't have many scholars accepted in the big academia in the West. I'm talking about the Circassians, and the same goes for other minorities. We don't get often scholarships like the one I've got. Harvard University, I'm the only Circassian ever been accepted, granted a scholarship at Harvard Kennedy School and at Harvard Nieman Foundation. And that's not because there are no Circassians working in similar fields. There are in Syria and across the Middle East, but and in the academia, but not in the accepted in the area of the Western scholarship. The idea of decolonization getting more and more attention, and even the Russian leadership, which actually usually ignores such topics, I think intentionally ignores them, started talking about it. Former President Medvedev last week actually called Russia an empire. I mean, Russian Federation, he called it an empire, and said that if this contemporary Russian empire is attempted to be decolonized, the half of the world will suffer. It's going to be a catastrophe, and half of the world will disappear with it, as it happened every time in history, he said, when any empire in history collapsed. That's such a lie. And we know, there are examples of decolonization, peaceful decolonization. There are bloody decolonizations in history, but there are peaceful decolonizations as well. I don't know which way Russia is going to go, but I think this is the only way that is leading to a better future for all people of Russia, including the Russians themselves. Thank you so much.
Fatima, thank you for that wonderful presentation. The three of you have given us an enormous amount to talk about. So if you are out there in the audience, now is the time to think about and ask questions. You can ask questions of the whole panel. You can pose questions about our topic in general, or of course you can pose questions to specific panelists about their presentations or their areas of expertise. There's a few that have come in over the course of the conversation, and maybe I could start with one of those. And let me say to those of you in the audience who are submitting questions, there's not much utility in having a moderator if I'm just going to read your questions. I will relate your questions, but I may modify them or frame them in a way that is going to be able to speak to all of the panelists or to the larger issues. The first question is really goes to the heart of the panel. Previous panels in this series have talked about decolonization in a more academy-focused way. This one is about impact beyond the ivory tower, and the question is about the relationship in each of your areas between politics and scholarship. If it's the case that a lot of the discussion in the academy about decolonization has been politically charged, includes calls to decolonize, commentaries on political events and moments. The questioner asks, is taking a public position on this or that foreign policy event running the risk of having scholarship perceived as politically motivated? That is sort of a yes or a no question. You don't have to answer it that way, but I would invite you to think about what is the relationship between scholarship and decolonization and politics in your three areas. What, in other words, is specific to decolonization in this beyond the ivory tower kind of framework we're talking about? So you can have a specific or a broad framing of that question on the general relationship between scholarship and politics when we're talking about decolonization. And I don't have any particular order in which I would invite you to think about that, but
I can start.
Yeah, go ahead.
Something that I was, along with my friends in Central Asia, have been discussing a lot, that we are so accustomed to the idea that scholarship produced in the West is somehow objective, whereas scholarship produced in Central Asia about Central Asia is political, nativist, nationalist. And this happens again and again when, let's say, there is a conversation between a Western historian and someone from Central Asia. A Western historian would say, well, yes, the bad things happened during the Soviet regime, but there were also people who collaborated with the Soviet regime. So obviously there probably were good things there too. You can't deny the good things. And then a scholar from Central Asia would say, wait a minute, how can you talk about it? And I have specific conversations in mind. I'm kind of retelling them without naming names. And the scholar from Central Asia would say, but how can you have collaborators in a totalitarian, brutal regime? It's when people choose between being purged or survive. And then the scholar from the West say, well, but you sort of implying that you probably have a political view of this, nativist view of this, and here I am. I have a more objective understanding of what had happened. So it absolutely looks political to many people how we bring out decolonial discourses, and that's maybe a good thing. That's okay. If it's seen as political, because yes, it does become political from our part, from scholars from Central Asia in diaspora. I'm sure same with Fatima as a journalist, because it is about bringing out our perspective in a way that it matters, so that it matters and that it is heard. And we need to be political about how we do that. So, but I don't think our message is political. It's our way of bringing decolonial discourse political. And but the message, hopefully, a decade from now, will be more of a mainstream and will be more broadly perceived as objective as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Erica.
I mean, I'll say a brief disclaimer in that I'm, clearly broadcasting from inside the ivory tower myself. Our library is part of a very large research apparatus, and most research librarians, most research collections function sort of in the way that I described, but also by default in this sort of feedback loop where scholars tell us what they're interested in and we in turn supply it. So it's very symbiotic, what the political valences tend to shift based on who is at your institution and what their priorities are. But the larger sphere of libraries, at least in America, for folks who have been following the news here, have certainly been, dragged into the political sphere in a way that they, I think, haven't been in the recent past. There's been a wave of book bannings at public libraries across the United States. There's been legislation that has been introduced in a lot of places, and in Tennessee, I think, recently passed to ban drag shows and other sort of visible celebrations of trans identity in public spaces, but in a way that's very transparently aimed at libraries in particular. So, in general, I would say that the library as an institution that, as part of its identity, welcomes people, in theory, welcomes all people into it, has always functioned as a sort of political space, which, depending on the library you're in, could make it easier or harder to articulate a particular stance on any given issue. But I think that when it comes to decolonization, one of the things that I didn't really mention in my presentation, but that is kind of a theme throughout the book also, is that librarians have a lot to learn from our counterparts. Area studies librarians have a lot to learn from our counterparts who work in Indigenous and borderland studies. I think those are areas where, again, decolonization is a very concrete concern with specific outcomes. So I think that in navigating, this particular issue within the field, there's a lot to be learned from looking to people who are navigating that issue with Indigenous American populations or Canadian populations. I would not go as far as to tell anybody, in other regions how to apply that to their own experience, but it provides a jumping off point when speaking to people in the region or, counterparts at libraries in Russia, Eastern Europe, Eurasia, to sort of talk about how these issues are being shaped here, and then hear about how they're taking shape in their respective countries, because libraries also function differently in those places, not just for political reasons, but also just for cultural reasons. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Anna. Fatima, did you want to say anything on this one?
Yes, I can add just that in my opinion, it's not that the scholarship, scholar community is dragged into politics, or media dragged into politics by talking decolonization. It's the topic itself is political. It's about returning the people colonized by, part of the empire at this age of time, their political rights. How can you avoid politics when you talk in such topics? It's as simple as that, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. While we're talking, Fatima, I wondered if your presentation gave a very comprehensive portrait of what colonization and decolonization might look like from a Circassian perspective, and I wondered whether you could say a few words about whether and how some of that has changed in the context of the war in and on Ukraine. Have there been any notable shifts in what that decolonial discourse or experience is that are, have taken place over the past year, really, granting the history that you have talked about, both its erasure and its visibility? Have things changed at all?
If you speak about the Circassians, the wake-up call was actually before this, the last February full-scale invasion, and even before the 2014 initial launch of the war against Ukraine. It was the Georgian parliament recognition of the Circassian genocide. It was the first time the Circassian community united in understanding that the world recognizes what happened to them. And there is a government that actually accepts, yes, you were victims of the genocides and you have a right to return to your homeland. Even in the diaspora, Circassians, eventually generation after generation started believing that the home is lost forever. There is no way of getting that back, even partially, or being recognized for what they are, survivors of brutal colonial genocidal war and deportation. So that was a wake-up call for the Circassian community. As for this war, when we see what is, there are different tendencies and events going on in diasporas when it comes to the Circassians and what's going on in the homeland. Most of the people who were active in the field of Circassian I just lost the word for this, for the future of Circassia as an independent state, or even some kind of sovereignty, those people actually left Russia, left the Caucasus, and they reside now either in Turkey or in Georgia or in Europe. The remaining people there could be divided into categories: those who are brainwashed, and some of them volunteer to go and fight in Ukraine against Ukraine. We have people who go and fight for Ukraine against Russia. There are such Circassians in Ukraine, and there are people who are forcibly mobilized and taken to the front lines. New coffin and body coming back from Ukraine, the attitude is becoming more and more anti-Russian. I'm not saying it's pro-Ukrainian, but anti-Russian. In general, I can say that maybe not just the Circassians, but a lot of people who are not Russians are looking at Ukraine and its hoping for its victory over Russia, and they believe that that victory is essential for their own future. I spoke with many Circassians in diaspora, and they believe that when Ukraine wins, Russia is going to be weakened, and we will be able to regain our state and our independence and rebuild our state. That's what I hear mostly from the people of my ethnic background, and I think that's the more general attitude toward the situation in Ukraine, and that's how it affects the Circassians.
Wonderful, thank you. So this is a question that's directed at Erica's presentation, but I can imagine versions of it for each of you. And the question is, you've talked about public reception to discourse on decolonization in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. So that's sort of what you were talking is the movement out into the public of this kind of discourse. And the question is, can you talk more about how the Kyrgyz and Kazakh states have perceived, mobilized, or reacted to that discourse? So this question gets nicely at some of the circulation we're talking about. It's not just sort of impact beyond the ivory tower, but then how is it that states or other political actors react to that movement? And Fatima and Anna, you may have some thoughts on this. You both said some things about this already, but there may be other things you want to say in response to this question. But we'll start with Erica on this one, since it's a quite specific Kyrgyz and Kazakh question to begin with anyway.
I think they appreciate it, and both Kyrgyz and Kazakh and other Central Asian regimes, ruling regimes, they use national symbols for domestic legitimization to show their alignment with the people, with the public. Kazakh government has allowed and times encouraged the study of ashashlik, the Great Hunger in 1930s in Kazakhstan. The Kyrgyz government is also, I believe, facilitated events of remembrance of 1916. That said, there of course the energy for decolonial discourses and practices really is in the grassroots movements, organizations, scholars, activists, and they could do a lot more, especially the scholarly community, if the governments opened archives. But the governments are not opening archives, and it's becoming harder and harder to actually access historical documents. So it is, again, they appreciate that because it's not directly pointing at them as the villain. It's not a critique of their rule, but they could do so much more by trying if they only declassified archives from the Soviet period.
Interesting. Anna and Fatima, you can either take this one or you can pass. It may or may not be directly relevant to you, but if you want to pass, we can move on.
Yes, I'm going to pass on this one. Thank you.
Okay.
I can't quite articulate a version of an answer that gets at the question directly. I think that's partially because for my field, the specific corner of the field, area studies librarianship, as I said, the scholarship on it is so largely rooted in individual disciplines historically that it's very new to look at it as an entire discipline with a history that's rooted in state reactions to global politics. So I think that there will be more to say as time goes on, and publishers have more discrete reactions to decolonization discourse. But for now, I'm still formulating my thinking on that.
Mm-hmm. So let me pose a question that I think speaks to all of your papers, and this comes from one of the participants as well, although I'm going to slightly reframe it, which is that all of you spoke about histories of colonization or of empire and their impacts or effects on decolonization discourse at the moment. And these were in various ways, ranging from the sort of library collecting practices to Erica's family photographs. But it's also the case that, like, some of the research and scholarship on empire and colonization has for years now sort of uncovered some of this. It's not new. We're not discovering in the past year that Russia is an empire, or that there were victims of the Soviet regime, or these frameworks are not entirely new. So what is different about the present moment as we think about decolonization beyond the ivory tower, given that this is not entirely new in the ivory tower, or even in the relationship between the ivory tower and beyond the ivory tower as it might have been configured a few years ago? What do you sense is different at the moment as we're having this conversation in your particular area?
I think I would sort of summarize it as, knowing those things is not the same thing as letting the affected people, reclaim agency. And I think that's the biggest change that I'm seeing, or at least the biggest sort of shift in how we respond to that knowledge. as I think all of us sort of talked about in one form or another, histories of violence and repression toward minorities have been articulated and known about for a long time, and the causes or the effects of those things for the sort of library or museum cultural heritage profession has been the result of entire cultures being lost, entire ways of organizing knowledge being lost. We've also known about that, and we've acknowledged that in various ways. In the acknowledging, though, and I think this has come up recently in sort of discourse around land acknowledgements, which have become more common, there's issues to be had with, does that further historicize people who are still alive and still live in those places? Are you acknowledging what happened to them and then moving on, basically acknowledging that something bad happened and acknowledging is enough? I think that the change that we're hopefully moving towards in various ways is being able to account for a more fulsome experience for people that have been historically subjugated. So, what are their knowledge systems? What are the things that they care about? Their literature, their art, their intellectual history, their intellectual networks. Those are things that were sort of shunted to the side, at least in Western information systems, that we're hoping to document more fully and clearly, and in ways that fully give agency and participation to the people that we're documenting, rather than making a note that they exist and moving on.
Yeah, if I may add, I absolutely agree with that. It is becoming a more self-aware process of knowledge production, that it is important to incorporate voices that are from the region. And I want to build on what Anna said, that it's also a lot of the inequalities in knowledge production have been exposed, how Western scholars and Russian scholars in particular, and I'm talking about Central Asia, knowledge production on Central Asia, have become accustomed to using Central Asian scholars as sources, as facilitators, as fixers in Central Asia, and not offer, for instance, co-authorships or not citing them enough, right? So this is simple things like that. At the same time, I would push back against this notion that we've been discussing this for a while. So what is new? I think a lot is new. I think the Western scholarship on Central Asia has adapted this mantra that, yeah, a lot of things were really bad, but good things happen too. But look at all those schools and electricity and factories and all that stuff, right? So yeah, there is this yes acknowledgement. Yes, bad things happen to you, but it's sometimes it's implicit, sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's the title of a book, a whole book. So, and the decolonial discourse now says, no, you can't, there is no but to this. There's no but. It was a traumatic experience. Imagine if Russia occupies Ukraine through genocidal violence and then builds factories and schools and whatever else, railways and all that. Will there be a but to that? Of course not. Our understanding of what happens in Ukraine is terrible. And I think a lot of the solidarity and sympathy with Ukrainians comes from the realization that Russia is not a benevolent empire, altruistic empire, that what it is doing today in Ukraine was how it built Soviet Union 100 years ago. So nothing is worth this level of violence and suffering. I think this is the important point in discourse now, and we can discuss for a very long time just the political economy of knowledge production and how formally panels that's on Central Asian politics, whatever else, were and different conferences or think tank events. I live in DC, were formed that how different voices were represented. But that's a whole other conversation as well.
Thank you, Erica.
Yeah, regarding knowledge production and knowledge distribution, especially when it comes to Central Asia or Ukraine or former Soviet Union republics who are still affected by the Russian influence and are undoubtedly the victims of Russian Empire, compared to the people who are still, part of the Russian Empire. That difference makes that is a huge difference, because when people have a state, that state actually supports, the production of the knowledge, research, and distribution of that knowledge within its own population and worldwide. But the people like my people, the Circassians, don't even have that tool. For instance, last week, the Russian FSB raided research facility, the research institute in Nalchik in Kabardino-Balkaria, and they confiscated all the computers, and that institution was doing scholarly research on history and the Circassian culture, and that's it. And that was dangerous for Russia. How are you going to give, to distribute that kind of knowledge when it's the people are deprived even of tools to do that? That's the situation with this. Or speak of Holodomor. My grandmother on my mother's side had 7 children when the famine started, when the communists confiscated everything. By the end of it, she had 1 child, my grandfather. And she said that their children were laying outside in the yard, and there was nobody to bury them because people were so weak, they couldn't even lift, a shovel to bury children. And the same about my grandmother on my father's side. She had 5 children. She lost 4 of them. My father, the youngest, survived. And nobody talks about this Holodomor in the North Caucasus. Thousands, if not millions, died there. Ukraine has a tool because it's a state now. It can, analyze, support research, produce books and academic works. We don't have that kind of resources, unfortunately. So that's about the distribution. And you don't see anything in the media either, because media mostly relies on the work done by the scholars.
Thank you, Fatima. We have only a couple of minutes left. There's a couple questions here that I think maybe I'll summarize and point to some ways in which I think you've already been answering them, and they are sort of about both about the question of, well, okay, so now decolonization discourse is spreading. We see it moving beyond the academy. What are some dangers of that? And one danger highlighted by one questioner is, decolonization can be an imperialistic tool and often has been in the hands of the United States. How do you avoid running into the arms of decolonization as just another tool for colonization? And the second one is related, but sort of from a politics of knowledge question. If there is some desire to decenter and to note that knowledge is part of that decolonization thing, and one is decentering it, that is a nice move. It's good to trace this beyond the academy into activist communities, but how does one go beyond that to ensure that the entire apparatus of knowledge and the central role of Western knowledge practices and, from universities to journal publications to things like that are part of what is being decentered, conferences, things like that. And I think I would say to both of those questioners that we've had a lot of good examples from Fatima's comments about fellowships to Erica's about the organization of conferences to Anna's about taking some inspiration from things like land acknowledgements and incorporation of or more respect for indigenous communities and their visions of what decolonization means. And I think in those answers you have some pointers to those questions of how does one practice decolonization without replicating either knowledge structures or a sort of politics of imperialism that the U.S. has engaged in. There's a final question which I will confer, not necessarily expecting an answer because we're at time. But one of the questioners points out this deep tension between a vision of peaceful decolonization that Fatima pointed out to and the sort of apocalyptic nuclear imagery that one finds emanating from certain Russian politicians who Fatima also mentioned these days. And in a very practical sense, if decolonization involves some sort of breakup of the Russian Empire, territorial autonomy, a lot of those nuclear weapons are located in the territories, and nuclear proliferation was a major concern in the 1990s. So even the peaceful versions of this begin to look worrisome in the ways they might be reconnected to empire and colonization and violence. So I can't promise you that is a hopeful or reassuring way to end, but such are the times in which this panel is being constituted. So let me thank everybody for joining. Let me thank our panelists for all of their work in the world, and also for their work in preparing for and making these presentations and answering your questions. And we're all grateful to our colleagues at the Davis Center for putting together this panel and the whole series. Chris, you have reappeared. You may have some final words for us all.
Yes, I want to also express my thanks to each and every one of you, and you as well, Doug, for helping to bring together these important presentations and providing context. And I just wanted to remind everyone who's with us to please join us for our next session. Let me share my screen here. You'll note that our next session is not next Friday, but it is 2 weeks from today on Friday, March 17th, same time, 12 to 1:30 p.m. And we'll be discussing syllabus design and critical pedagogies in the classroom. How do we teach differently? And that session will be moderated by Koresh Shank from Nazarbayev University, with presentations from Shoshana Keller, Professor of History at Hamilton College, and Dr. Lewis Porter, Assistant Professor of History at Texas State University. So thanks again to all of you for being here, and thanks to you who joined us today to watch, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Have a great day.